Okay, if trapezoid ABCD is isosceles, find the measure of angle ABE. So an isosceles trapezoid has congruent legs, so we'll mark that. It also has both sets of base angles congruent. So if this is 65 degrees, then this is 65 degrees. And I can see these two angles form a linear pair. So if one is a right angle whose measure is 90 degrees, these two have to add to 180. This also has to be a 90-degree angle. And within any triangle, we know that the sum of its interior angles is 180 degrees. So if you remove this 90-degree angle and the 65-degree angle from 180 degrees total, you're left with only 25 degrees to make up that triangle. So the measure of angle ABE is 25 degrees, and that's how you would write out that answer. Next. Find the value of x if the midsegment of a trapezoid is 20 centimeters and the bases have measures of 3x minus 2 and 7x minus 8. So the midsegment is the average of the two bases. And anytime we average something, we add them up, divide by 2, just like when we find a midpoint, we're finding the average of the two endpoints. We add up our x's, divide by 2, add up our y's, divide by 2. It's that same concept. So when I add these two bases up, and I combine like terms, I get 10x minus 10. That's the sum of my two bases. To average them, I take that sum and I divide by 2, and that's equal to the length of my midsegment, which is 20. From here, I multiply both sides by 2, so I get 10x minus 10 equals 40. I add 10 to both sides to get 10x equals 50, and then divide both sides by 10 to get x equals 5. Next. Find the value of x using the rectangle below. So this got a little smudge whenever we printed it out. I know that if this is a rectangle, I know those two angles are congruent. And the reason I know those two angles are congruent is because a rectangle is also a parallelogram. So if this is a parallelogram, I know that its diagonals bisect each other at the midpoint, meaning this is congruent to this, that segment is congruent to that segment. But because it's a rectangle, we also learned that the diagonals, the full diagonals, are congruent to each other. So if these two are congruent, and this is the midpoint of each, the midpoint of two congruent segments is going to be the same, and it's going to split those segments all into congruent parts. So I really know that all of those are going to be congruent, which means this is an isosceles trapezoid. So because it's an isosceles triangle, since this is an isosceles triangle, the angles opposite those congruent sides are going to be congruent, or the base angles of an isosceles triangle are congruent, just like the base angles of an isosceles trapezoid are congruent. So 5x plus 10 equals 7x minus 8. Can subtract 5x from both sides to get 2x on the right, add 8 to both sides to get 18 on the left, and then divide both sides by 2 to get 9 equals x. An isosceles trapezoid ABCD, segment AE is 2x plus 5. Segment EC is 3x minus 12. And segment BD is 4x plus 20. Find the value of x. So we learned in class that if you have an isosceles trapezoid where these two sides are congruent, this side's congruent to itself, and we know the entire base angles of isosceles trapezoids are congruent, we learned that this triangle ACD is congruent to this other triangle DBA, and we learned that this triangle here is congruent to this triangle right here because of side angle side congruence, which means all of the corresponding parts are. And these diagonals are corresponding parts of those two triangles, which means those diagonals are congruent. So if you have an isosceles trapezoid, that means these diagonals BD and AC are congruent to each other, which means their lengths are also equal. The length of segment BD is 4x plus 20. The length of segment AC would be the sum of these two segments together, which is 5x minus 7. So now I can solve that equation to find the value of x. Subtracting 4 from both sides, I have x on the right. Adding 7 to both sides, I have 27 on the left. And just like that, I get 27 equals x. If you wanted to check your work, you would take the 27, substitute that back in for x, and you're going to get the same length for segment BD as you do for segment AC. So it's a good quick way to check your work. Determine whether quadrilateral ABCD with those vertices is a parallelogram, a rectangle, a rhombus, or a square. So the best way for you to do that is to find the slope. So I've already drawn this in for you, but it's a little bit hard to see where it's printed out. So here's point A at -1, -4, -1. Here is point B at 1, -1. Here is point C at 4, 3. And here is point D at -1, 3. And so if I were to find the slopes of all of these using slope formula, I get the slope of segment DC is 0, the slope of segment AB is 0. So I have one set of opposite sides parallel. So I know AB is parallel to DC. That's one set of opposite sides. Then if I calculate the slopes of these two using slope formula, I know the slope of AD is 4/3, the slope of BC is 4/3, which means that those opposite sides, AD and CB, are parallel. So I have two sets of opposite sides parallel. That means, yes, it is a parallelogram. So two sets of opposite sides parallel tells us, yes, it is a parallelogram. That's a test for parallelogram. So there's one. Now I also need a test for a rectangle, rhombus, or a square. So if it's a rectangle, I know it has 4 90-degree angles, which means the slopes of your consecutive sides would be opposites and reciprocals of each other. That means we have parallel lines here. But 0 and 4/3 are not opposite reciprocal slopes, which tells me these two sides are not perpendicular, so they do not form a right angle right here. So no, it cannot be a rectangle. So our consecutive sides are not perpendicular, which means we do not have 4 right angles. So not a rectangle. Okay, then we want to do a test to see if we have a rhombus. And if you go back to your Venn diagram, you can see I'm not looking for anything involving slope with my sides. To find 4 sides congruent, slope doesn't tell me that. To find if diagonals are perpendicular, slope tells me that, but I need the slope of the diagonals, not the slope of the sides, which is what I have. To find that diagonals bisect opposite angles, that's not something you can show on a graph. So you either need to find the slope of both diagonals to see if they are opposite reciprocals, or you find the distance of the 4 sides to see if they are congruent. So I do know that because this is a parallelogram, I do know my opposite sides are congruent. I know those two are congruent to each other. I know that those two are congruent to each other because I've already determined it's a parallelogram, so I know that's true. So I could do distance formula for 2 consecutive sides, because whatever the length of this side is, if it matches that, then I know all 4 have to be the same. Or again, I can find the slope of diagonals. So I'll go ahead and I'll do slope on this one. You guys have had a lot of practice with distance formula. So I need the slope of segment AC, that's a diagonal. And I also need the slope of segment BD because that is a diagonal. So for segment AC, rise over run, the change in y over the change in x, I have -1 minus 3 over -4 minus 4. Or -4 over -8, which simplifies to be 1/2. So that's the slope of segment AC. For segment BD, rise over run, change in y over change in x, I have -1 minus 3 over 1 minus -1, which we know right here that's really adding. So we have -4 over 2, or slope of -2. And if I look at those, they are in fact opposite signs, one's positive, one's negative, and they are reciprocals of each other, which means our numerator and denominator has been switched out. So because of that, since they have opposite reciprocal slopes, I know that my diagonal AC is perpendicular to my diagonal BD, which means they intersect each other at a right angle. So my diagonals intersect at a right angle. My diagonals are perpendicular, they intersect to form right angles. It is in fact a rhombus and does pass that test. So, rhombus, yes. And until if it's a square, it's only a square if it is all three of these. There's no special test for a square, you just test your way through parallelogram, rectangle, rhombus, and if it's all three, then it's also a square. So it is not a square because it is not all three. So those two. And remember, there are lots of tests that you can do, so just make sure you check your Venn diagram and you know that in order to show sides are congruent, you do distance formula. To show sides are parallel or to show sides are perpendicular, you need slope formula. Parallel lines have the same exact slope. Perpendicular lines have opposite reciprocal slopes. Four right angles are formed by perpendicular sides, so if you can find the slope of two consecutive sides that touch, like this, and those sides have opposite reciprocal slopes and they're perpendicular, that means there are right angles. So that's how you can show that you have a rectangle. Okay, next. Determine whether quadrilateral ABCD with those vertices is a parallelogram, a rectangle, a rhombus, or a square. So we'll start by graphing. A is at 1, -1. B is at 2, 2. C is at -1, 3, and D is at -2, 0. So start with parallelogram. I'm going to try, I'll do slope again for parallelogram. So I'll start with side AB. So rise over run. My change in y from -1 to +2, I have -1 minus 2 over my change in x, 1 minus 2. That's -2 over 1. I have a -1, which is a slope of 2. That's the slope of side AB. I'm going to immediately go to the opposite side from that, because if this opposite side is not parallel to this, then I can rule out parallelogram or rule out all of them. So this opposite side DC, I want that slope, rise over run, so the change in y, I have 0 minus 3 over my change in x. I have -2 minus -1. Be very careful there because that's really a positive. So -3 over -1 gives me a slope of 3. And I can see these two opposite sides here are not parallel. And I have to have both sets of opposite sides to be parallel to be a parallelogram. And since they're not, I know that this is not a parallelogram. And if it's not a parallelogram, it cannot be a rectangle, it cannot be a rhombus, it cannot be a square, and you do not have to continue doing any more tests. Okay, next. Find x and y using the parallelogram below. If I tell you it's a parallelogram, that means opposite sides are parallel and you can mark it. It also means that opposite sides are congruent and you can mark that. So if my opposite sides are congruent, I can set those values equal to each other. So 2x plus 8 equals 3y minus 6. And these two, I can say 4y minus 10 equals 2y plus 6. This has an x and a y, this just has y's. I can solve this equation, then take my y value, substitute it back in here, and then solve that equation for x. So this is what I'm going to do and start here. If I subtract 2y from both sides, I have 2y on the left. If I add 10 to both sides, I have 16 on the right. Dividing both sides by 2, I get y equals 8. So there's my y value that I'm looking for. Substitute that back in right here. 2x plus 8 equals 3 times my y8 minus 6. Or 2x plus 8 equals 24 minus 6. Or 2x plus 8 equals 18. Now I can subtract 8 from both sides to get 2x equals 10. Divide both sides by 2 to get x equals 5. So make sure you have all of your tests memorized. For parallelogram, opposite angles are congruent. You cannot show me that on a graph. You can show me diagonals bisect each other at the midpoint by using midpoint formula. You can show me that opposite sides are congruent by doing distance formula. You can show me opposite sides are parallel by doing slope. You can show me that there are right angles to make a rectangle by doing slope. To find opposite reciprocal slopes for 4 different sets of perpendicular sides. You can show me diagonals are congruent by doing distance formula. You can show me it's a rhombus by doing distance formula to verify that all 4 sides are congruent. You can do slope formula to show me that diagonals have opposite reciprocal slopes and are perpendicular. You cannot show me on a graph if diagonals bisect to form opposite angles. You need to first test for a parallelogram, then test for a rectangle and then a rhombus. And if it is all 3, then it is a square. If it is not a parallelogram, you stop your test and you do no more because it's not any of the others. Remember that a trapezoid has 1 pair of parallel sides, not 2. So you need to do slope for both sets and verify that one set is parallel, not both, and it is a trapezoid. It's an isosceles trapezoid if it has congruent legs, which means it also has congruent base angles, and congruent diagonals. Those are all true for isosceles trapezoids. Kite has perpendicular diagonals, which I can draw in here, meaning those form right triangles. Has 2 pairs of consecutive sides, these 2 and these 2. And 1 pair and only 1 pair of opposite angles congruent. And the angles that are congruent are the angles for the 2 sides that are not congruent.